12 biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved. Episode 1. The story of King Arthur has been told and retold numerous times over more than 1,000 years. Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, the wizard Merlin, and the sword Excalibur are all famous parts of the Arthurian tales. However, if King Arthur did really exist, the reality was likely less magical. The earliest surviving accounts date to the 9th century and tell of a leader, perhaps not even a king, who fought several battles against the Saxons. Even the accuracy of these accounts is debatable. There are a number of sites in Britain that legends link to King Arthur, such as Tintagel, a coastal site that was supposedly King Arthur's home. But excavations have not confirmed whether Arthur ever lived there or even existed. Ultimately, it seems unlikely that scholars will ever know for sure whether there was a real King Arthur or whether the man was purely fictional. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 2. William Kidd, more commonly known as Captain Kidd, was an infamous Scottish privateer who sailed the seas in the late 1600s. He was commissioned to arrest pirates by the British government, but was ultimately hanged for piracy himself in 1701. Before his ignominious death, Kidd captured and plundered many ships, but the one of that got him in hot water was the Quedagh Merchant, a Moorish trading ship laden with gold, silver, silks, satins, and other treasures from India. Kidd claimed it was a legitimate target, given it was controlled by the French. But it had an English captain and Indian merchandise, and the Mughal emperor at the time threatened to close off trade routes for the East India Company in response, Reuters reported. When he discovered he'd been branded a pirate, he abandoned the ship, which sank off the Caribbean. The wreckage of the Quedagh Merchant was finally found in 2007. During his trial, Kidd wrote a letter claiming he pilfered around 100,000 British pounds and buried it somewhere, offering to trade the location for his life, according to Reuters. However, during the trial, it was estimated that the takings from all his time aboard the adventure galley likely totaled closer to 400,000 pounds. To his dying breath, Kidd argued he was a legitimate privateer who had only ever plundered targets approved by the Crown. But he was hung and his body covered with pitch and squeezed in an iron cage displayed over the Thames. Either way, none of this treasure has ever been recovered, and likely never will be. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 3. Writing in the 4th century BC, the Greek philosopher Plato told a story of a land named Atlantis that existed in the Atlantic Ocean and supposedly conquered much of Europe and Africa in prehistoric times. In the story, the prehistoric Athenians strike back against Atlantis in a conflict that ends with Atlantis vanishing beneath the waves. While no serious scholar believes that this story is literally true, some have speculated that the legend could have been inspired, in part, by real events that happened in Greek history. One possibility is that the Minoan civilization, as it's now called, which flourished on the island of Crete until about 1400 BC, could have inspired the story of Atlantis. Although Crete is in the Mediterranean and not the Atlantic, Minoan settlements suffered considerable damage during the eruption of Thera, a volcano in Greece. Additionally, archaeologists found that the Minoans were eventually overcome, or forced to join with, a group of people called the Mycenaeans, who were based on mainland Greece. It's unlikely that this debate will ever be fully settled. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 4. By the tender age of 32, Alexander the Great had swept across Asia, conquering a region from the Balkans to Pakistan, and ruling over the biggest empire in the ancient world. Then, in 323 BC, he died, and his empire fell like a house of cards. The ruler was felled by an illness in Babylon, now Iraq. Historical documents suggest one of his generals brought his body back to ancient Egypt 2 years later, and that his body was held in the city of Memphis while a tomb was built for him in Alexandria. However, No one knows exactly where that iconic tomb is located. Some have suggested it has sunk beneath the waves because it was built in the Palaces district that is now submerged. If that's the case, it may have been destroyed now by millennia of both human and natural forces, experts previously told Live Science. Even if it were to be found eventually, there would likely be few identifying marks proving the tomb belonged to the ancient world's greatest leader. The historians who described the building of the tomb left little in the way of physical description, so researchers would need an intact inscription to find it, experts said. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 5. Virtually everyone who celebrates Christmas is familiar with the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, aka "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Believe it or not, the origin of this poem has some mystery attached to it. For many years, no one knew who wrote it. A Visit from St. Nicholas was sent anonymously to the Sentinel, a newspaper in Troy, New York, and first published on December 23, 1823. The poem proved enormously popular, but the author's identity was unknown. Finally, in 1844, a professor named Clement Clark Moore claimed credit for writing the poem, which had been sent to the Sentinel by one of Moore's friends. The story goes that Moore was hesitant to take credit for the poem because he was embarrassed by it and considered it unscholarly. However, some historians do not believe Moore was the actual author. A professor named Donald Wayne Foster presented compelling evidence in 2000 that the real author of A Visit from St. Nicholas was actually Henry Livingston, Jr., who died in 1828. Foster believed the poem bore a striking resemblance to Livingston's other writings, but was a strange anomaly in Moore's body of work. Some called Moore a sour, unsentimental individual and asserted that A Visit from St. Nicholas did not fit his persona, but other historians disagree. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence in favor of Livingston is that the names of Santa's last two reindeer in the poem were originally Dunder and Blixen, and only became Donder and Blitzen because of a printer's error. Many years later, Moore wrote out copies of his poem, but committed the same mistake by writing Donder and Blitzen. The words Dunder and Bliksem are actually Dutch for thunder and lightning. Moore spoke no Dutch, but Livingston did. Still, after 2 centuries, the debate rages on about who really wrote "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 6. In 1888, Jack the Ripper killed at least 5 women in London, mutilating their bodies. A number of letters, supposedly from the Ripper, were sent to police taunting officers' efforts to find the Ripper. Whether any of them were actually written by the Ripper is a matter of debate among scholars. The name Jack the Ripper comes from these letters. Needless to say, the Ripper was never found, and over the years, dozens of people have been brought up as possible candidates. In his 2012 book, Jack the Ripper, The Hand of a Woman, John Morris suggests that a woman named Lizzie Williams was the Ripper, although other Ripper experts cast doubt on it. It appears unlikely that the true identity of the Ripper will ever be known for sure. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 7. For more than 2 centuries, stories have circulated that Oak Island, located off Nova Scotia, Canada, held a money pit of buried treasure, supposedly left by the pirate captain William Kidd, 1645 to 1701. Over that time, numerous expeditions costing millions of dollars have traveled to the island, searching for the lost treasure to no avail. Despite centuries of searching, no treasure has been found on Oak Island. Nevertheless, that doesn't stop people from trying to find it. A History Channel reality TV show called The Curse of Oak Island follows a modern-day expedition. The show's 9th season premiered in 2021. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 8. While many Christians today celebrate December 25th as the birth of Jesus, he likely was not born on this day. The date, December 25th, may have been chosen because it's close in time to Saturnalia, a Roman festival that celebrated the god Saturn. The earliest records of December 25 being the birthday of Jesus date to the 4th century AD, more than 300 years after his birth. Ancient records suggest that early Christians were never able to agree on a date when Jesus was born, and even today many Orthodox Christians celebrate Jesus' birthday as being on January 6 or 7. In the end, it is unlikely that the date of Jesus' birth will ever be known. In fact, even the precise year is not certain, although scholars generally agree that it was sometime around 4 BC. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 9. Another treasure tale that will probably never be resolved is more ancient. In 1952, a copper scroll was found by archaeologists in a cave, along with other Dead Sea Scrolls, at the site of Qumran. As its name suggests, the writing was engraved onto a copper scroll. The scroll records a vast amount of hidden gold and silver treasure. So much, in fact, that some scholars believe that it is impossible for it to exist. The scroll dates back more than 1900 years to a time when the Roman Empire controlled the Qumran area. There were a number of revolts against Roman rule at the time the scroll was written, and scientists have hypothesized that the treasure was hidden to prevent its capture by Roman forces. Whether the treasure is real, where exactly it was hidden, whether it was ever found, and whether it could still exist today, are all mysteries that will likely never be solved. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 10. This is one of the biggest mysteries in American history that will never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, although some speculate that he wasn't the only shooter. On November 24, 1963, before Oswald could stand trial, Oswald was fatally shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Ruby died of lung cancer on Jan 3, 1967. The most widely accepted explanation is that Oswald killed JFK on his own and Ruby killed Oswald on his own volition. Ruby's stated motivation was to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the discomfiture of Oswald coming back to trial. However, there are still a significant number of professional historians, along with many amateurs, who do not agree with this explanation, and since JFK's death, numerous alternative explanations have been brought forward by historians and amateurs. Given that significant new evidence is unlikely to appear, a firm consensus will probably never be reached. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 11. On July 22nd, 1587, John White arrived to Roanoke Island with another 120 people along with him. A few months later, he sailed back to England, hoping to restock on badly needed supplies. But when he finally returned 3 years later, every last resident had vanished. The only clue to their potential whereabouts? The mysterious word Croatoan, carved on a palace day, and another Kro carved on a tree. White assumed the residents had traveled to Croatoan Island, which is now called Hatteras Island. But a storm blew in and prevented White from reaching the island, and he never raised enough money for another search. Some documents suggest Chief Powhatan killed some of the colonists, but there's no archaeological evidence to back that up. Other theories propose the residents were attacked by Native Americans or by the Spanish. Others assume the colonists simply died of natural causes. Whatever the case, the fate of the colonists is the biggest unsolved mystery in American history. Biggest historical mysteries that will probably never be solved, Episode 12. Ancient writers describe a fantastic series of gardens constructed at the ancient city of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. It's not clear when these gardens were built, but some ancient writers were so impressed by the gardens that they called them a wonder of the world. Around 250 BC, Philo of Byzantium wrote that the Hanging Gardens had plants cultivated at a height above ground level, and the roots of the trees are embedded in an upper terrace rather than in the earth. So far, archaeologists who have excavated Babylon have been unable to find the remains of a garden that meets this description. This has left archaeologists with a question. Did the Hanging Gardens really exist? In 2013, Stephanie Dalley, a researcher at the University of Oxford, proposed in a book that the gardens were actually located at the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Over the past 2 decades, both Babylon and Nineveh have suffered damage from wars and looting, and it seems unlikely that this mystery will ever be fully solved.